This is, in the beginning was the sound. This is a quote from late in the book on page 305. In the beginning was the sound, and they all knew what the sound sounded like. And one of my critical sources actually says that is a play on Scripture, book of John, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Mind you, I said on Monday, and I will reiterate, this is a subject matter where the commingling of sex, politics, and religion are almost a necessity to really address the text truthfully and frankly. And the theoretical reading and research that I've done on this text necessitates that we mention sex, we mention politics, we mention religion. I don't ever mean to propose that one interpretation rules out another interpretation, or that my views on those three very controversial topics are correct in any way. I'm just proposing theories and interpretations, propositions that you're welcome to digest critically and do with as you will. But very clearly, this is, I mentioned the text from Monday. I'll mention the text. One of the texts I'm using today is an essay called A Love Supreme, The Jazz Aesthetic Strategies in Toni Morrison's Beloved by Lars Eckstein, professor of English at the University of Tübingen in Germany. And so he is arguing in this title, A Love Supreme, that there's a connection to jazz. I'm arguing that there's a connection to blues, but there's definitely an interrelationship here between these musical traditions. But I'm focusing on this idea. In the beginning, there was the sound, and this idea that words have a musicality. So we're coming from something that was initially an oral tradition and not a written tradition. Okay, and this cat Eckstein quotes another critic called Kimberly Benston and saying, "Black language leads toward music, that it passes into music when it attains the maximal pitch of its being." And probably around the late 60s, when you had the great orators of the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power Movement intersecting with popular music, you had where word became music. Clearly, Gil Scott-Heron, the Last Poets, who were forerunners of hip-hop born around 1981, 1979, Sugar Hill Gang, somewhere around there. Hip-hop is a musical genre where the word is music. And the African-American literature and poetry tradition is a musicological and an oral tradition. And so this guy, Eckstein, is arguing that the verbal and the musical code in sound are not exclusive, but that they're similar. And so I read Beloved as a big, fat, long rap, okay, as a freestyle, as a poem, as a song, as a musical form of literature. And I read it in the blues tradition and in the gospel tradition simultaneously, as these are one tradition for me. And there's other people that are going to agree with me that I'm going to cite here, but you have to understand that this is a controversial stance even within the blues scholars, okay? People who study the African-American blues tradition, a lot of them are going to see the blues and gospel in tension. And there's these binary oppositions. What I've done on the screen here is I've posed oppositions. And these are fairly obvious oppositions if you look at blues versus gospel in a superficial way. The blues man is always a rebel. He is rebelling against something. Okay? And we get to the blues in Beloved, the blues characters are Paul D. Primarily, he's our blues man, but also secondarily, the Beloved, the ghost, is a blues girl. The blues is in revolt against submission. It is in revolt against slavery. It's in revolt against death. It's in revolt against the master. Okay? It is a perpetual art form of rebellion. And historically, the gospel tradition involves submission in contrast with that revolt, submission to a higher power. The redemption that is offered in the church tradition is often contrasted with the rebellion of the blues tradition. And really, in a sense, this is the tension that we have every weekend. We live in this tension. If we live 7 days a week, the blues is the sound of Saturday night, and gospel is the sound of Sunday morning. One of my favorite rock stars said that that really he likes both of these musics because one is about running away from God and the other is running to God. You often have heard in the blues tradition of making a deal with the devil. Some of the great blues artists were said to have actually dealt in the supernatural. There's kind of almost this mystique around religions that are non-Christian religions, that are pagan religions derived from Africa, possibly a voodoo religion like you have in New Orleans, but you have this kind of occult ideal around the blues, that there's kind of some kind of voodoo, hoodoo, mojo man magic going on here that isn't of God. That it's different, it's a deal with the devil, and oftentimes this is a deal that involves the sins of the flesh, and so clearly you're going to see the tension if you look at the one argument that the blues is the music of the flesh and gospel is the music of the spirit, and that these two are in opposition to each other. I am going to attend to, in today's talk and Friday's talk, to get rid of these oppositions, to collapse these oppositions, to show that these tensions can operate in a way that some of the theorists, and here's a grad school word, operate dialectically, meaning that between these two oppositions you come up with a third option that involves both. So instead of A against B, instead of either rebellion or redemption, there's a third option, C, that involves elements of the both. And I'm going to argue in the African American tradition, you have the best of the blues and the best of the gospel forming a musical and cultural and political tradition that is not exclusive of one, but inclusive of both. And all of these point towards liberation and freedom and resolution, as I believe you have a musical resolution in Beloved that involves redemption, and it also involves liberation, and I'm going to get there today and on Friday, and hopefully we'll talk about it next week, and y'all can pose your counter arguments, or we can work this out together. But to understand Paul D as a blues man and Beloved as a blues girl, and a little bit of the elements of the blues that spring up out of the pages of this text, I'm going to give you some specific examples of the blues in Beloved. But before that, I'm going to work through a definition of the blues, a couple definitions of the blues that we can work with. I don't have my Ralph Ellison. I've got my Cornell West on audio. I'm going to play that for you in a minute. I'm going to read you a little bit from a couple sources. I discovered this source last year when I was teaching Beloved to a women's studies class. It's called Blues Ideology in African American Literature by Houston Baker. And he's got a couple of ideas here for us about the blues. And he's going to say that defining the blues is about as easy as defining a world-class athlete's awesome gymnastics. So, like, how would you describe LeBron James's aerial gymnastics in that commercial on Sunday, in the Super Bowl commercial, if you saw that? How would you describe a diver, a gymnast? How would you describe a great catch, as we saw many this past Sunday on both teams? How would you describe a swimmer, a skier where we'll see skiers in the Olympics? Yes, he says it's very difficult to define the blues, in part because there's this sensibility of defining the blues that either you got it or you don't. Reminds me of a quote from the 60s. You're either on the bus or you're off the bus. You kind of had to be there. You know, when people are telling stories about their exploits in life, the parties they've been to, the adventures that they had, man, you had to be there. I can't really describe it to you. You had to have been there. There is a sensibility about the blues that you can't be there unless you're there. But then again, we got these scholars like Houston Baker, who is going to go and write an entire book and call it a vernacular theory to try to tell us what the blues are. And he says the blues are a synthesis. And he lists where it comes from. Work songs. Okay, so you saw an example of an African-American work song. We're going to see that with Paul D. in the text. Group seculars, field hollers, sacred harmonies, proverbial wisdom, folk philosophy, political commentary, ribald humor, elegiac lament, and much more. An amalgam, meaning a mixture, a stew, that seems to have always been in motion in America. And he's going to argue that the blues are a transient art, that they're an art of motion. I think we're going to see that in